We're in the last few verses of Hebrews chapter 4. If you haven't already turned there, please do so. While everybody's getting settled, if you hadn't gotten the word, Shane Carrington's got a upper respiratory something, been to the doctor twice, and we are moving the meeting back a week. So it was supposed to be Saturday and Sunday, so we're moving back to next Saturday and Sunday. So please take note of that. Sorry about that. We didn't want to wait until Friday at the last minute and Shane say, hey, I'm just still too sick to come, and then have to try to make changes. So we've gone ahead and made that change, so please be aware that, you can show up at 6 o'clock Saturday evening. You're more than welcome to. If you got a key, you can come in, turn on the lights, but nobody else is going to be here. So at any rate, that's the latest news. So everybody please take note of that. Spread the word. May try to send a one call out Friday just to make sure that everybody gets that message. But if you see anybody from here that you talk to regularly that's not here, please make sure that you're passing that word along. So hope everybody's well. Thanks for being out in the rain. I know it's a nasty night, but it's an encouragement to me to see you here. Bill, would you lead us in a prayer when we get started? Thank you, Bill. We left off in the discussion in verse 14 of chapter 4. Before we actually get into that, let me make this observation to you, or ask you to give some thought to it. Several people have come up over the last couple of weeks and made observations to the effect of, Hebrews has got a lot of stuff in it. It's interesting all the different ways that the writer pulls in Old Testament, not just passages, but concepts, and builds on them. There's a couple of things I want you to take note of. Really, this is kind of a good stopping point or a time to make this point. I want you to notice, first of all, how much of the concept or all the concepts that we've looked at so far, who Jesus is, Jesus in comparison with the angels, Jesus as he relates to Moses, Jesus and why he becomes a man, Jesus as an exalted figure, all these things that we learn about Jesus. I want you to notice that all the arguments come from the Old Testament. Okay, and the reason I make that point is, when I was growing up, quote unquote, in the church, the way we like to say it, the Old Testament was not underscored a lot. Now, there were a lot of things going on in my generation growing up that preachers and elders had to deal with, and I'm not passing judgment or criticizing anybody. I just didn't hear a lot of Old Testament growing up. And my dad was a pretty well-rounded preacher. He didn't ride a hobby. And I must tell you that I was probably college age before I started coming to an appreciation of how the Old Testament lays so much groundwork for our understandings in the New Testament. Hebrews brings that out, I think, probably better than any other book in the New Testament. Look at all of these concepts. These concepts we have are built upon things that God had been revealing for a long time. Paul makes the argument in Galatians 3 that the old law was a schoolmaster, and that's really not the best translation. We don't have a good term for this. The word's pedagogue in Greek, and what it means is the servant who conducts the children from the home to the teacher. Okay, that's what a pedagogue was. I heard somebody say bus driver is a good way to understand the concept, and it is. And the point that Paul makes there is what the Old Testament does is it takes us from fundamental understandings about God, and then it leads us to what God really wants us to know. I want you to appreciate that that's what's going on in Hebrews. Okay, I recognize that some of the arguments are involved. We don't always get how the language is being used, how the writer focuses upon this word here and this word there. But I do want you to see how many of the concepts are rooted in what God has said for centuries, okay? And what that does for us is the very argument of Hebrews is it builds your faith. It helps you to understand that who Jesus is and what Jesus did is something that God had planned actually before He ever created the world. And when you start seeing that and it starts taking root in your mind, it'll do as much to increase your trust in God as anything in the world. And so I want you to appreciate, how much of what we're studying here, the writer just keeps going back and saying, this is what God intended from the get-go. And we're about to start talking about the priesthood. We're about to start talking about Melchizedek. We're about to start talking about the sacrificial system and the covenants and all these different things. And what we need to understand is when God instituted them all in the Old Testament, He didn't just do that for them. He did that for us. So we could now look back and go, wow, that was God doing that all along. And that is impressive to me. And I hope it's impressive to you. The other thing I want you to notice is we are at the point in the letter where the admonitions start becoming very, very pointed. Like what we looked at Sunday in verse 11. Let us be diligent to enter that rest. Okay? That applies as much to us as it does to them. And I know that sometimes the reasoning through it and the putting all the passages together becomes taxing, but I don't want you to miss the admonitions because they're going to become more and more regular and more pointed. You've got to work hard. Don't fall short. As he said back in chapter 2, you cannot neglect the Word of God and drift by it or let it drift by you. As he says in verse 16, which we're about to look at, we need to come boldly to the throne of grace. If your faith is being tested right now, I tell you what you need to do. You need to recognize who Jesus is, and you need to pour out to Him. And so all of these admonitions that we're going to see over the next couple of chapters are very pointed, and they're just as applicable to us because we have the same issue they did. When things get hard, when we get pressure, and the pressure involves our faith, and people want to try to dissuade us from our lives of service, the answer to that is my faith grows stronger the more I appreciate God and the more I appreciate the Lord. And that's the only way faith grows stronger. And so that's where the Hebrew writer goes, okay? So as we get going, questions or comments before we actually look at these next few verses? Tonight's verses, beginning in verse 14, he's going to come back to the idea of Jesus as a high priest, which he already introduced back in chapter 2, and he's already made the observation back in chapter 2 that Jesus is a faithful and merciful high priest because of the things that he suffered. And that's part of what chapter 3 was about. Chapter 4, the admonition has been, don't miss the rest. There's a rest remaining for God's people. Children of Israel going into the land of promise did not fulfill what God really intended for us. And so, as he said back in verse 9, there remains a rest for the people of God. Verse 11, be diligent to enter the rest. And then verse 12, 13, and 14, or verse 12 and 13, kind of go with what we're looking at tonight. And the reminder is God knows what's going on. God's Word it pierces to the very heart of mankind, and God sees everything. If you're putting on a good show, but your faith is really suspect right now, God knows that, okay? But when you get to verse 14, there's a kind of a different side of that. Here's the threat of judgment, but then verse 14 is, seeing then we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. This is almost a repetition of the admonition back in chapter 2, where he begins talking about Jesus in his lowliness, being suffering and being crowned with glory and honor. And then in verse 17, he is a faithful high priest. He suffered because he was tempted, so he's able to succor us. And now you come to verse 14 and said, look, you need to take advantage of what we have. What's the problem with this argument for us? I know that's a very general question. When you read verse 14, 15, and 16, is there anything about it that you go, well, okay, I get it, but? Yes, sir, Daniel? Okay, there's a lot of years removed between us and them. That's definitely true, and that's sometimes an obstacle for us. Let me come at it this way. How many of you came out of a religious group where you had a priest? Not very many. 3, unless you came out of an Anglican, Catholic, Episcopalian, Presbyterian. If you came out of what we think of as the evangelical, the Protestant, or maybe the charismatic denominations, if that's where your background is spiritually, we don't really have a concept of a priest. For most of us, we've never thought of talking to God and needing a priest, have we? I know for me it's very foreign. I was asked years ago to write an article about the priesthood of Jesus, and I got to thinking, I really don't have a good understanding. I know intellectually what a priest does, but I don't have a real good understanding, so I called up the Catholic priest in town. I asked him if I could come by and have a conversation with him, and I just basically said, tell me what you do. And he spent the whole time telling me what he didn't do because he was scared to death I was writing some kind of expose on him. I said, no, listen, I'm just trying to understand because I'm trying to write an article about the priesthood of Jesus, and I don't come from a Catholic background. I don't have practical experience with a priest. But these people, if they wanted to offer a sacrifice and ask God to forgive them, what'd they have to have? They had to have a priest. And if they belonged to the nation, and the nation was going to maintain its relationship with God, who made the one sacrifice a year that kept the nation right with God? The high priest. Okay? And in their mind, when they went to the tabernacle, or in their day it would have been the temple, and they went with a gift or a sacrifice, there's no way they could approach God unless they brought that to the priest. And then the priest acted on their behalf and acted on God's behalf toward them. And so there wasn't any real relationship with God as far as intimacy without somebody between them and God. And they certainly couldn't go into the place that represented God's throne. They couldn't even go to the holy place, much less the most holy place. Okay? So for them, any relationship with God was a relationship that demanded somebody to stand between me and God. Now, that's very foreign to our thinking unless you came out of a certain religious background. If you came out of a certain religious background, my suspicion is the things that is said about a high priest make more sense to you than they do to a lot of us. Okay? Because you grew up with this concept, I've got to have somebody. All right? And the truth is, we do have to have somebody. But for those of us who didn't come through that kind of old religious background, we've always understood Jesus as our priest. It's just not been real practical for us. And so I want you to appreciate that when he starts making these arguments about Jesus as the high priest, and this really drives the rest of the book. I know he talks about sacrifice and covenant and all these different things, but all of it has to do with who Jesus is as the high priest. Okay, so this to me is really the heart of the book, is Jesus in his role as a priest. It's imperative we understand we have no access to God without a priest. I know the New Testament says that we are priests to God. I get all of those concepts, but still, I cannot come before my God without somebody making intercession. All right? Even as a forgiven man, Jesus stands between me and God and speaks on my behalf. In chapter 7, he's going to say, he ever lives to make intercession. And that is imperative that we understand that the only reason we have any relationship with God at all is because of Jesus. And the Jews got the concept. It was just hard for them to understand Jesus in that position. We understand Jesus in that position. We just don't get the concept. Okay? So I want you to try to chew on that as much as you can. It's not something that you're going to spend the next 10 minutes and go, oh, okay, I get that now. This is really something that has to be thought through a lot. Okay? But the argument then in verse 14 is, we need to not lose our trust in God so that we can enter into the rest. We need to be diligent. We need to remember God knows what's going on. God sees our heart. God judges our heart. We're not going to fool Him. But I want you to also appreciate the positive side of this. We can come before God because Jesus is making intercession for us. And the argument really is that Jesus is qualified. First thing he says in verse 14 is, seeing we have a great high priest who has what? Passed through the heavens, which is a really good translation of this phrase. Some of the older versions says who's in the heavens. The idea is that Jesus ascended. Okay, and to the Jews, God's up there on the other side of the firmament. And he still is, I think, in a lot of our thinking. Okay? But when the Jews thought about God, God's up there, and when Jesus ascended, what did he do? He passed through the heavens. So where is the high priest? Where is our high priest? In heaven, in the very presence of God. Where was the Jewish high priest? Yeah, wherever the temple was, or the tabernacle if you back up. Okay, is that a big difference? Yeah, because the Jewish high priest was never actually in the presence of God. He was in the place where God manifested himself, but he wasn't actually in heaven where God is, and that's the argument that's made. This is our high priest, not like what you had before. Our high priest stands at the very right hand of God. Notice in verse 14, he describes him as Jesus, the Son of God. Okay, this combines a lot of concepts. Jesus, the man, the one who was crucified, the one who was the prophet, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, the one that probably in the first century, they're still trying to wrap their head around the idea that Jesus was God. Once again, something that we take for granted, but something they had to learn. It wasn't an easy concept for them. So here's Jesus. Jesus was God, the Son of God, and Son of carries with it the idea of the firstborn here, the God in the flesh. He was God. He was God's only Son, and he is with God right now, having passed through the heavens. And that's who intercedes for us. There's the high priest part. So if I brought a sacrifice to God as a Jew, I'd have to take it to the temple. But now I just take it where? Straight to the Lord. Because the high priest is with God and is speaking to God for me directly. And so it's a concept that for us, it's almost like, okay, what's the big deal? But for them, this is a huge deal. Okay, so the idea is, since we have that priest, let's hold fast our confession. I think this is the third time he's already said something about holding on to our confession. And once again, the idea is don't lose your trust. Don't be affected by whatever's happening in your life, by the threats that you have, or the suffering that you're involved in, or the persecution that you're dealing with. Why? Because our high priest is in the very presence of God himself, and he is God. But then you get to verse 15, but we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. I read an interesting point about this the other day, and we get this. I mean, when you pour out your heart to God because you're struggling, do you think God understands? Why does God understand? Because of Jesus. Now, again, this is a concept that, and he's going to come back to this 2 or 3 times. It's a concept that is fascinating and really challenging because I believe God understands everything because He's God. There is no knowledge that He does not have. But the practical experience of living as a man in a human body and what men go through, God didn't have. Could He understand it academically? Sure, He's God. But this adds another layer to God, okay? And He does that for what reason? Is it because God needs that knowledge? So that we can understand that God understands me. And I'll tell you how this really plays out because, I mean, honestly, and this is a bit of a loaded question. How many of you have really, really seriously in your life suffered because you're a follower of Jesus? Okay? Physically? Physical persecution? No, at the most, our suffering, it may be economic. You may lose your job. Okay, I know people have lost their job because of their faith. It's probably most of the time going to be emotional / mental, the way people treat us, social ostracization, those kinds of things. That's probably the way that most people have suffered for their faith. Okay, for the most part, we don't come to God and say, I am suffering at the hands of ungodly men and I need some help. You read it a lot in the Psalms. In fact, it's all over the Bible, but we live in this little window of history where we've just pretty much been exempted from that. Okay? I tell you where this really plays out, I think for us, at least I'll say for me. Yeah, I've got my stuff that I deal with, my temptations. Some of them I deal with pretty well, some of them I don't deal with real well. And some of them I find myself having to come back again and again and ask God to forgive me when I slip up in my weaknesses. And that's as much as I'm going to tell you, so you can come back later. You know, this is not going to be, I'll tell you and you tell me, okay? We all have our junk. But I tell you what, most of our junk we deal with. We struggle with the same stuff over and over. Do you ever mess up and then think, I can't ask for forgiveness again? How many times? How many times have I lost my temper? And then come back and say, God, you know, I was doing pretty good. And I have messed up again. How can I ask you again when you've forgiven me all these times? I really believe this idea of we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses. The idea is He knows what it is like to live as a man and have to deal with the pressures of faith in the midst of difficulty and what that's like. You know, when Satan comes to him in Matthew 4 or Luke 4, that's not the only time Jesus was tempted. I mean, great day. You know, he had brothers. Don't you know he wanted to kill them at times? And they weren't always kind to him. In fact, they ridiculed him a couple of times. That's mentioned in the Scriptures. You know, he lived with parents as a teenager. Don't you know he was tempted? He dealt with people in business. His dad was the town carpenter. You think people didn't come in, you know, hey, you didn't fix this wagon wheel right, and you know you fixed it right, and the guy went home and messed with it, and he tore it up, and then he brings it back and wants to blame you. I mean, Jesus dealt with life. And while he didn't sin, he was tempted to sin just like you and I are, probably just as much, maybe more. And I read an interesting comment this week that said, you know, sometimes people think, well, Jesus can't sympathize because he never messed up. You know, it's a lot harder to never mess up than it is to mess up and go ask for forgiveness. Have you ever thought about that? What he did was harder than what you and I do because you and I give in, and he didn't, but he knows the pressure. Now, that's where this becomes really practical to us. The only way that I have confidence that God will forgive me when I've asked for forgiveness for something that I have done repeatedly in my life, knowing that it was wrong, is understanding that Jesus knows what it is like to live as a man. He doesn't excuse my sin, but He understands. And so when He speaks to God as my intercessor, He speaks to God from a position of knowledge and experience. And so we don't have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted like we are, yet without sin. So let us come boldly to the throne of grace. You know, to the Jew, they couldn't just walk into the most holy place, but that's the point being made. We can come boldly to the throne of God. That would have been the covering to the ark to them. And we will find mercy and grace to help in time of need. And this needs to be real to us, folks. It would have been very real to them, maybe more real to them than to us, because of their concept about the priest, and that's the only way they could really get to God. And we need to appreciate that this is what Jesus does, and so it's what He's doing this very second, and He'll be doing it the next second, and He'll do it until the world ends, and He does it for each one of us. And the point that the writer's making is, don't forget the judgment of God, but don't forget the help that God gives you as well. And that's just powerful stuff. Especially when you think about that when God ordained Aaron to be the high priest, this is where that was all going. This is why God started all this priesthood stuff. So that you and I could sit here thousands of years later and understand that God understands. Okay? Questions or comments? Does that make sense to you? Yes. Yeah. But he was, right? Well, I mean, he was never married, so I don't know that he was ever tempted to murder. But I'm sorry. I wouldn't say, I would say it if Tracy was here, and I'd hear it. But I think the idea is there isn't any kind of temptation he didn't deal with, Bill. And there's a very real sense in which we're tempted in just almost any way you can think of. Okay? Is it every specific, hey, I found a lottery ticket and it was a $30 million ticket and now I'm tempted in a way I've never been tempted. We all understand the temptation of covetousness. Okay, so if you look at it kind of in a generic sense that all temptations basically fall into, if you go to 1 John, lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, the pride of life, I don't think there's anything that we have to deal with that Jesus doesn't understand.
Exactly.
Okay?
Which is my point.
Yeah.
He has seen it all.
Yeah. But it may not be every specific. I mean, Jesus did not raise children. Unless you stop and think about that as God, He's been raising children ever since He created man. Okay? But as a man, there's some things I may deal with that He didn't have to deal with. But He understands the pressure of being a man and trying to be godly. I mean, honestly, that's the real temptation, isn't it? It's not that temptation, it's trying to live the way God wants us to live. That's where temptation comes from. Paul makes this argument in Romans. I wouldn't have known covetousness unless the law had told me you should not covet. Okay? Greed wouldn't be any temptation if we didn't believe in God and understand that greed was wrong. Right? And so, our temptations all fall into these certain categories, and the real temptation is I'm trying to do God's will, not my own. If I cared not about God's will, there's really no temptation there. I'm just doing what I want to do. And so what Jesus understood was, here's what it's like to live as a man trying to please God. And all the weaknesses, what it feels like, what temptation feels like, how powerful it can be. How it can come grab you. A roaring lion jumps out of the bushes. All of a sudden, you're mad or you're proud or whatever the temptation is. Jesus understood how that worked because he lived for 33 years as a man, having to trust God. And I think that's the point. Does that help?
Well, and the devil too.
Well, yeah. I mean, well, devil's behind all of it. Yeah. Dennis, you want to say something? Yeah. 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 But we do understand all sin basically at its root is selfishness, and our desires are being appealed to. And Jesus had all that. His desires were appealed to by Satan, okay, and by men. And so he, in all points, yeah. I wouldn't say that every specific thing you could come up with something. Surely Jesus didn't, he never got frustrated with his iPhone, all right? But his technology is far beyond iPhone. He probably wouldn't get frustrated with his iPhone, okay? That's a rabbit hole that you start going down that you can just run around underground forever, okay? Huh? Yeah, that's true. Unless Satan put an app on it like your grandkids can do, okay? Right, John Tom? Okay, anybody else? Okay, so this is where the high priest discussion's going, and this is going to drive the discussion for a while. In fact, really the first 10 verses of chapter 5, he's going to build on the idea of the high priest, of Jesus as a priest. And what he's going to underscore is two things. The priest was appointed by God, and the priest represented men. Okay, and those are the two things he's going to underscore in chapter 5. And so he starts off this way. Every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. Because of this, he is required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sins. And no man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was. The idea is that's who gets the honor. So Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And he also says in another place, "You're a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh, when he offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things he suffered, and having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek." So we'll stop there if we even get, we probably won't get that far tonight. Okay? But the point, having said everything we've said, the point that he makes in chapter 5 is fairly straightforward. Okay? They understood the priest, and what they understood was two things. Number one, the priest was a man. And so in verse 1 through 3, what does he tell us about the priest? Well, he's appointed by God. He's appointed by God to act for men. Notice that in verse 1. Every priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God to offer gifts and sacrifices. So here's the priest's role. He is a man whom God has chosen to represent other men to offer sacrifices for them. David?
I don't understand how or where in Scripture that God appointed a priest to high priest.
Okay, well, you go back. This would be rooted, first of all, in the old law where God appointed Aaron to be the high priest. That's the way the Jews would have understood it. Now, he's going to go back before the Levitical priesthood about Jesus' priesthood, because Jesus wasn't a priest according to the law of Moses because he wasn't a Levite. That's where the Melchizedek stuff's going to come up. But the concept is what he's working on. All right, and the concept is a man is appointed to be the priest, but he starts off, he is a man who's acting for men in order to help them come to God. Now that's the first argument. Okay, we'll come back to the appointment part, but that's the first argument. He's a man. And in verse 2, here's the point of him being a man. He can have compassion. And if I don't know what versions you're reading, my marginal reading is deal gently with. And so really the idea is he can feel for somebody who's offering a sacrifice for sin. But it's not just that he feels for them, he feels with them. It's a little different than sympathize or empathize, and the idea is how he acts on their behalf. He can deal gently. He can deal gently with them because he himself is subject to weakness. And so you think about the high priests, any of the priests, but especially the high priest under the Mosaic law. Okay, just start with Aaron. He was the first one. Did Aaron have any faults? I mean, the golden calf's the first thing that pops into my mind. And then later on, he and Miriam are all upset because God gives the preference to Moses, and yet God's dealing with them. Aaron had his fair share of flaws, okay? Do you not think that when God assigned Aaron to go into the most holy place with the sacrifice for the nation, do you not think that Aaron was conscious of the fact that he shouldn't be the one doing this? Because he was as guilty as everybody else was? I'm going to tell you one thing about preaching that I really appreciate in regards to this argument. Man, it's hard to stand up and talk to people about what we ought to be doing when you're not doing what you ought to be doing. I mean, the sense of self-condemnation. And I think you see that throughout the Bible in people that were speaking for God. That often very conscious. I mean, think of Isaiah when he is called, "Woe is me, I am a man of unclean lips. Who am I to stand before God? Who am I to be a spokesman?" And I get that. I really do get that. And that's the argument that's being made here. God chose men to represent men in things pertaining to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices. But one of the things about those men is those men were subject to the same weaknesses. Somebody comes and offers a sacrifice for sin because they've stolen something out of greed, when the priest himself has to deal with greed. How hard is that to offer sacrifice for somebody else when you struggle with the same weakness? And so that's the argument that's being made. And because of that, a priest taken from men can deal gently, can have compassion, cannot be too terribly hard on the people that are coming and using him to represent them to God. So he can, if you back up to verse 15 of the last chapter, he can sympathize with their weaknesses. And so verse 3, because of this, he's required, as for the people, so for himself, to offer sacrifices for sins. And the point is, he has to offer sacrifices for himself before he can offer sacrifices for anybody else. So he's taken from the people, he's like all the people, he deals with stuff as the people do. And if he was a conscientious man, that would make him a really good priest. Okay? So that's the first argument. And then the second argument in verse 4 is, no man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was. So there's your, God's the one who appointed the priest. Now, let me offer this, and we'll finish with this point, because the first bell just rang. The Hebrew writer's talking in the ideal. Okay, by the time he's writing, even in Jesus' day, who chose the high priest in Israel in Jesus' day? The Romans did. It was a political office. It was a perverted office. It wasn't anything like God designed. But in the ideal, and the Jews understood that God was really the one who was supposed to choose the high priest. And that's why sometimes, for instance, in Jesus' case, you almost have two high priests. You got Caiaphas and you got Annas. One was the rightful high priest. The other was the politically appointed high priest, and the people recognized that. So the writer is arguing the ideal. Here's the way God designed it. All right? No man takes this honor to himself, ideally, but he who is called by God is the one given the honor, just like Aaron was. Now here's the application in verse 5. So Christ didn't glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he, that is God, who said to him, Jesus, you are my son, today I have begotten you. This is from Psalm 2. Okay, and he's already used this argument to say Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God, and he begot him when he raised him from the dead and brought him to heaven. And so the argument's already been that Psalm 2 identifies Jesus as the one God's speaking about. Okay? He is speaking to the Messiah, who we understand to be Jesus. And from everything I've read, the Jews would have taken Psalm 2 to be a completely messianic psalm. They understood God was talking about the Messiah. But then he ties it to the 110th Psalm in verse 6. He also says, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Okay, here's the tie-in. Who is the you in verse 5 and the you in verse 6? You are my son. You are a priest forever. The Messiah. Okay, both of these psalms, God is talking to the Messiah. And that's the point he's making. So what does he say in them? Well, in one of them he says, you're my son, and you are reigning. He's already established that back in chapter 1. But now he also says, you're a priest on your throne. So the point that is, and the Jews would have been able to put this together, that the old law, when God is speaking about the Messiah, God made it very clear that the Messiah was going to be God's king upon his throne, but that he was also going to be a priest. And that's what these messianic psalms were teaching. Okay, and so that's the way he uses them. We'll stop right there. That's not a bad stopping point, actually. And then we'll pick up Sunday morning in verse 7 and move on as far as we can. Here's my schedule. Haley is supposed to be induced tomorrow evening. So hopefully we'll have a baby by Friday. And I'm planning to go to Florida either Sunday afternoon, Sunday after services Sunday morning, or Monday morning early. So we'll have class Sunday morning just like normal. Next Wednesday singing. Wednesday after that Shane's going to be here. So we shouldn't have to miss anything, and you don't have to substitute. Okay? All right, there we go. Thanks, guys.